Today we're going to talk about gesture, contour, and by extension, line sensitivity. So this is the first topic that we will go over in order to review what is hopefully just a review, something that you're familiar with, but that can be really helpful to just spend a little bit of time on before we move on to topics that may be new. So I love this illustration of a bow on the right-hand side. One is more of a contour line drawing version of the bow, and one is more of a gesture drawing of the bow. And of course you can see that they're quite different. The upper drawing has more detail. It feels almost as though the pen is touching the edge of the surface of the bow itself. It dips in occasionally to get some of those contours or shapes on the surface of the bow, and the gesture is a little bit more expressive and feels like it gives you the movement of the bow itself. So we're going to start with gesture drawing, and I use gesture drawing a little bit interchangeably with the idea of just a fast sketch. And a gesture drawing is perhaps technically a little bit different, but for our purposes, getting comfortable with a gesture drawing allows you to make those fast sketches, which allows you to really plan or just observe something a little bit more comfortably as you start drawing. What is a gesture drawing? A gesture drawing is a quick drawing that looks at the overall gesture, motion and shape and direction of an object or figure. It can be really helpful for learning how to stay loose while drawing and can help with making quick planning sketches. So, like I said, for our purposes, getting comfortable with gesture drawing is really about those quick planning sketches. So here's a nice example of a gesture drawing. We see on the left, of course, a very cute dog, and on the right we see a series of some pretty quick lines. We can tell they're quick because of the quality of the line that hits on some very key parts of the dog that actually gives the overall essence and shape of the dog. Gesture drawing is about the overall essence and internal character of the shape. So I like to think of, if we think of the body, we think of our skeleton and we think of our flesh. A gesture drawing is very much more about the skeleton, and a contour drawing is very much more about the flesh or the body, right? So the gesture drawing is about that internal character, the internal infrastructure, you could say, of something. It keeps the sense of fluidity and movement to the piece, even though the object or figure is still. And it keeps the overall shape in mind at all times, so you don't want to focus on the small details. Just some nice examples of what you might look for when you're making a gesture drawing. This is, of course, just a drawing overlaid on a photo. This again goes to that idea of the internal structure or the skeleton of something, being able to show you the gesture of it. Gesture drawings can look really different. Some people like to make gesture drawings with a lot of extra fluid lines because they're so loose that they're making all these movements across the page. Sometimes if you're drawing something that is moving, you could even draw these different iterations of, for instance, the figure moving, and the piece itself will have that overall feeling of movement, even when the objects are not moving, like what we see here. This is just a quick sketch for a still life. We can see that there is probably some wine bottles and fruit set up together. It can still have a really nice sense of energy to it. You can really decide how you like to make a gesture drawing. And of course, with materials like charcoal, some of the drawings may be very dark and heavy and opaque, and some of the drawings may be light and scratchy. It really depends on what kind of material you're using and what your goal is for the drawing. For our purposes, I'm going to encourage us to think about gesture drawing as that rapid sketch to help us move on to our more developed drawing. And just some more beautiful examples of artists using this ability, the ability to make the quick gestural sketch that can actually really help you make an incredible drawing. A lot of artists have depended on their ability to make gesture drawings. This is the work of the artist Alberto Giacometti, who's pretty well known for making sculptures like the one you see on the right, of these very elongated, skinny, long-legged, narrow figures. But this is one of my favorite drawings of his as well. On the left, it looks like the artist in the studio. And so, we can see that gesture drawing isn't just for drawing class. It can also really help us out in the world doing other things, planning for other things. Another artist who I love looking at their work is the painter Pierre Bonnard from 1915. And this piece is such a beautiful painting, but I love seeing this planning sketch of his above it, right? So again, we can see just how the gesture, the quick sketch can help artists make initial mock-ups or thumbnails, or even just explore ideas that may actually turn into much bigger ideas, which is exactly why we are going to work with the gesture drawing. This is just kind of a fun piece to look at. This is appears to be just a series of scribbles all together on a white surface, but if you look more closely, you'll notice that there's a signature. And in fact, this is a drawing by the architect Frank Gehry, who in fact designed Walt Disney Hall. So that's just in downtown Los Angeles. So think about somebody starting with this and ending up with that. We can see that sculptors, painters, architects, all of us, have had a reason to rely on the fast sketch, the gesture drawing. We'll be using them primarily for thumbnails and for planning sketches. These are some compositional or thumbnail examples that I'm sure you're familiar with. And of course, the thumbnail is meant to help you look at your subject and try examining it from different compositional angles. There are a few tactics for gesture drawing that I always like to recommend, and our first exercise will be to just go over these. Again, you may be very familiar with gesture drawing, you may be very comfortable, but maybe it's been a little while since you've been in a drawing class. Maybe you just want to brush up on some basic ideas. I know that even after something like almost 30 years of drawing, I still really like to keep myself comfortable with the idea of the gesture. So the three things I always recommend looking for when trying to work on a gesture drawing is the idea of a landmark point, finding the simple shapes within the object you're looking at, and if you can, imagining what that invisible cross-section that might show volume and direction of the object could be. So what do I mean by that? If we take, for instance, something like a simple white vase, like we see in front of us here, the first thing I want you to think about, or one of the first things I'd like you to think about, you don't necessarily have to think about them in this order, is the idea of landmark points. And landmark points are what they sound like, areas where there are directional shifts in the form and that are easy to return to. So if something's a landmark, it's something that you can recognize, that you see from afar, something that is memorable and you can actually get back to. So areas where there are directional shifts in the form. So if we go back to this idea of the picture, the white picture that we just looked at, there's a couple of areas on it where there is a directional shift, right? As this swoops up, it comes down this way, that's a landmark. As this comes out here, that's a landmark. Comes down to the bottom, landmark. And all of us may have different ideas of what feels like an appropriate landmark, but this is just something that can kind of start to help you place that object on the page. The next thing that I recommend looking at is this simplification of shapes within the shape you're looking at. So really, if we think about that vessel, there's kind of three overall shapes that make it up, right? So if you can find a way to get that onto your page, that's great too. And then the last thing that might give you a sense of depth or volume is if you think about the cross section, right? If you were to break those shapes in half, what might you see on the inside? You don't have to think about this, but this really helps you think about volume. And so you might end up with something like this drawing that we see here, right? It's a loose drawing. It has a lot of extra marks on it. It's not a finalized drawing, but it's a drawing that has a lot of energy and that really feels like it's looking pretty closely at getting the overall essence of the object itself. So one of the things that I'd like you to think about is how you can work with gesture drawings for organic and geometric shapes. And organic shapes are, of course, things like this gourd, shapes that allude to natural forms such as plants or the human body. Sorry, that's a little typo there. And this is often associated with more nature-made shapes. So for instance, like I said, this gourd or a pumpkin or whatever you want to call it, a squash. Geometric shapes resembling or employing the simple rectilinear or curvilinear lines used in geometry. These are things that are more rigid and have harder angles to them, more mathematically designed. They're often associated with machine-made objects and precision. You can find those forms a little bit more easily in any geometric form. So here we have a folding chair. You can kind of imagine this sitting in a larger cube and being able to draw the chair from that cube. So when you start to work on the assignment portion of this first part of our lesson, the gesture lesson, I want you to find a nice mix of organic and geometric shapes and just pay attention to which kinds of shapes feel like they lend themselves more easily to a gesture drawing. Maybe they don't, maybe they do, just something to pay attention to. A couple more notes. I just want to talk about materials for a minute. We're going to be using our graphite pencils to start, and you want to make sure to use the artist pencils, so the pencils that have numbers on them like 2B or 4B. I'll talk about that system in just a moment. And not a mechanical pencil or your charcoal or some other material. We're going to start with graphite. And this is just a fun little aside about other materials. Most of these materials are actually just carbon-based. So if we look at the sets of materials above, you can see their corresponding marks that they make. Some are very opaque and dark and messy, and some are more tight and a little bit easier to control. The first is a Conte crayon, which is also just carbon-based, so just taking something natural and burning it, and you're left with carbon, and that's mixed with lots of wax, and that makes a little bit of a cleaner, smoother mark. Graphite pencil, also carbon-based, only it's pressed into a cylinder, what we used to call a lead cylinder, even though there is no lead in it, and that is mixed and fired with clay to make clean marks. So pencils are a little bit easier to make a cleaner mark with than, say, a piece of Conte. Graphite stick is the same concept, except there is no wood surrounding the cylinder of the lead. Vine or willow charcoal, this is a material that we'll be using a little bit later in the semester and that you've probably spent some time with. Also carbon-based, so it's a natural material that's been burned. But what's so cool about vine and willow charcoal is that they're actual grapevines and pieces of willow trees that have been fully fired, and that's why they all have that really unique shape. And I just love the idea of a kind of incinerated piece of a tree that you're using to draw with. Vine charcoal, of course, leaves really light marks that can be easily erased, so those are great for planning drawings. Charcoal pencil, carbon-based, but mixed with wax and compressed, so a little bit easier to control and make that more precise mark. And same thing with compressed charcoal. It's carbon-based, mixed with some wax, and you can get really, really dark marks with a piece of compressed charcoal. So just a little aside about the materials that we will be using. Today, like I said, we're only going to be using our pencils. And just a little quick lesson on the pencil. The way that the pencils are named are like this. There's H pencils, which are the pencils you see going in descending order to the left, and to the right we have B pencils ascending. And right in the middle, we have an HB. HB is your really neutral pencil. It makes a nice clean mark, but it's dark enough. It doesn't smudge too much, but it's still pretty smooth and easy to work with. As you move your way to the left on the pencil chart, you will get to F and then H, right? And from H, you go H, 2H, 3H, 4H, and this continues for quite a while. I think the most I've ever used is like a 10H, but it might even go beyond that. And these are pencils that, as you can see, are quite hard, right? And as they get harder and harder, they get lighter and lighter. There's more and more binder mixed in with the graphite. And these can be really good for control and making light marks. I always like to think about older architectural blueprints and the way that architects would sign their names in these very clean, like all caps, highly controlled way of making their own font. And I could imagine that those architects were using really hard, dark H pencils because those don't smudge and it lets you make a really nice clean mark. B pencils are much darker and softer. They have less binder, so more of that carbon mixed in. And those go up quite high too. I think, again, the highest I've ever really used is a 10B. But you can see a 6B is already pretty dark and can get quite smudgy. So generally, having a good sense of what kinds of marks your pencils can make is really important. To start things off, I like to use a 2B or maybe a 3B or 4B if I am making a gesture drawing, and that's because I want the drawing to have a soft quality to it. And then as I start to clean it up, I might move over to a B or an HB, or even an H pencil if I wanted to really get a thin, light line. So start to think about your pencils and how to use them. So what we're gonna do from here is some warm-up gesture drawing exercises. So the next video that I'd like you to watch is the demo for how I want you to approach your gesture drawing exercises.